Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Manuel Suarez-Mier, who is an economist and former central bank official, economic diplomat, and professor at Georgetown and American universities. We'll be taking a look at Mexico and why he thinks this will be the year of President López Obrador's unraveling, why Mexico's economy looks bleak, and where the United States fits in. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Suarez-Mier.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you here.
Now, you've recently written quite the article at Asia Times that Mexico's prospects in 2020 are bleak and that its economy, institutions, and democracy are at stake. You believe that 2020 will mark the unraveling of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO's presidency. I thought I'd chime in before giving you the floor. You know, I'm a recently naturalized Mexican citizen, and I truly do feel Mexican in culture and spirit. I didn't get citizenship in time to vote for the elections, but regarding AMLO, you know, I considered one thing going for him was his anti-establishment position, but now after all that is said and done, I feel he hasn't delivered, and dare I say, he and his administration seem incompetent to deal with the great issues facing the nation. So can you perhaps now tell us, you know, why do you see Mexico's near-term future to be so bleak and that this could be the year of AMLO's unraveling?
For several reasons. First of all, it's clear in the 15 months that he has been in office that there is no learning curve. This is the same AMLO who ran for president in 2006, and he keeps repeating the same occurrences, the same weird ideas that have no sustenance, and there's no learning whatsoever on the job learning for him. He initially was convinced that he should be very careful with the macroeconomic picture of the country, and he was. But if you look at the figures, the only reason why they ended up having a little primary surplus in the budget, that is surplus once you ignore interest payments on the national debt. That primary surplus is misleading because they used a fund that was created many years ago to confront major crises that come from the outside, like the 2008 crisis. And the Ministry of the Treasury had been saving money for such occurrences. And in order to balance the books last year, the Ministry of Finance had to take about half of the funds in that trust fund, half of the monies in that trust fund, which means the monies left for confronting crisis and stuff like that have been diminished, and they will probably be pushed to do the same this year, in which case that fund will be depleted. Now, that means that on the ground, they are running a fiscal deficit, which is exactly the opposite of what they promised that they will do. And the reason is very simple. Tax revenues are down quite substantially, income tax and value-added tax, because economic activities is flat or negative. So you cannot collect taxes on an economy which is shrinking, which is exactly what's happening. On top of which, Mexico has, in order to keep an exchange rate reasonably in check, as it has been in the last year, the Bank of Mexico has kept interest rates very high at 7.5% at the prime rate currently, which are the highest interest rates in any country in the world, except those which are in a critical situation like Argentina. In terms of real interest rates, once you eliminate inflation, these are the highest rates. And that means that you have investment coming from abroad. The issues for this year that will come to a crisis will be the finances of PEMEX, the oil petroleum monopoly in hands of government that AMLO wants very much to strengthen. And it's a bankrupt proposition because that company is bankrupt. Basically, it has a debt load that cannot be paid by its revenues, and that demands huge transfers from the government, which the current administration is doing. But that means that it will require more money, which the government no longer has. That means that the rating agencies of Mexico's debt will probably downgrade PEMEX this year. They are already on the brink of being downgraded. And if that happens, that means a possible downgrade for the sovereign debt of Mexico. And that in turn means that all the trust funds and all the pension funds that have money invested in Mexico in fixed income instruments will have to flee the Mexican market because the rules by which they operate forces them to only invest in assets that are okay, that have a AAA ranking, which Mexico would lose. And that would probably mean an outflow of between 100 and 150 billion dollars, which is a sizable chunk of the reserve of the Bank of Mexico. And that added to no investment, no domestic investment, and no foreign direct investment would create a very serious balance of payment crisis. That would be the drop that unbalances the whole very precarious equilibrium that they have managed.
How catastrophic can this situation become? Does it have the potential to be something like the 1990s tequila crisis?
It could, because confidence is very difficult to keep once you lost it. And AMLO has been eroding at confidence of economic agents, and that means investors from abroad as well as domestic ones from the very beginning. What has kept the macroeconomic picture more or less quiet has been that, as I mentioned, that they've been fiddling with the figures and using resources that are not renewable. I think that could create a panic situation once you see that there is a large amount of foreign exchange leaving the country, capital flight by foreign investors who are no longer able to invest in Mexico because of the downgrading of its credit status. That means that you have a run also by Mexican investors and savers that will see clearly that the situation is untenable. And yes, that can lead to a financial crisis, very much in the form that we had in 1994 or 1982.
And your thoughts on the currency, for example. I'm noticing around the world a lot of currencies are experiencing problems. When I first arrived to Mexico in 2010, the peso was 10 pesos to the dollar, and now it's 20 pesos to the dollar. I'm currently here in Kazakhstan, and just a few years ago, it was, I think 150 Kazakh tenge to the dollar, and now we're almost at 400 Kazakh tenge to the dollar. And so, how do you think that what will happen to the peso? I mean, is it just going to continue devaluing?
No, the devaluation that we've had in the last decade has been sort of quite gradual. And just reflecting the differences in inflation rates between Mexico and the rest of the world, particularly the U.S., its main trading partner. But what you can expect if you have a sudden change in expectations for the worse is a much worse, dire situation in which you would have an abrupt fall in the peso, as we have seen in Argentina last year. That the peso went from 20 or 30 pesos per dollar to 100. I don't know how it's trading today. It bounced back to something like 80, but last time I saw. But in any case, it would be a rather steep depreciation of the currency, which, by the way, AMLO boasts every day that shows that markets have confidence in him. That's not the case. What markets are doing is taking advantage of high interest rates and the expectation that the currency will remain more or less stable in the short term. But everyone suspects or knows that in the long and medium and long term, that will not be the case. And that's on top of everything else that's going on. You have a country in which insecurity has increased quite substantially in the first year of his administration, despite his promises that he would end violence by a new strategy of embraces and not shots, not gunshots, which has been ridiculous and has made Mexico the laughingstock of the rest of the world. So you have violence increasing everywhere. You have crises produced by the incompetence of AMLO's government, like the scarcity of medicines in the public health system. And they provoked that. They ordered the previous administration, the Peña Nieto administration in 1918, to stop purchases of medicines that normally take place in the last semester of the year to be able to stock for the next year. So they ordered the sitting administration to stop any purchases because they were going to revise everything and make sure that there was, quote, no corruption. The fact was that as the year started and AMLO became president, the medicines started being more scarce, and the scarcity crisis has mounted, and you have a very serious breakdown in the health system of the country, in which they replaced what was more or less working, which is an insurance policy for everyone, with an institute, government-run institute that centralizes medicine, that aspires to be something like the healthcare system of Canada or the UK, but without the knowledge or the resources or anything to back it up. So it has broken down, and it's a complete disaster. And everywhere you turn in the real economy, that's exactly what's happening. Look at migration. AMLO came into office promising to be the welcome country to migrants from everywhere in the world who wanted to go to the US or whatever their destinies took them. Words create incentives, and incentives have consequences. So suddenly you had a flow of migrants, mostly from Central America, but also from the rest of the world. And now you had Africans and Haitians and people from all over the world trying to get to the US via Mexico. And Mr. Trump notices that and immediately threatens Mexico with tariffs on its exports to his country. And that was the end of that. At that moment, AMLO reversed course 180 degrees and put the newly formed National Guard, which is basically the army, instead of being in charge of the national security and citizen security in the country, he put it in charge of stopping immigrants from getting beyond the US-Guatemala border and trapping them along the way. So the human rights violations in this case are atrocious, and they are starting to be documented by international groups that do this sort of thing. On top of which, in the north, they accepted what Mr. Trump demanded, which is to accept all the refuse of asylum seekers in the US from other countries, which are processed by the legal system of the US, but the legal system of the US in charge of that has a backlog of several years. They don't have enough resources, enough judges specialized in asylum. So it's a mess. What the Trump administration did was to pass that burden to Mexico. And now you have 75,000 non-Mexicans waiting for their asylum applications in the US, but waiting in Mexico, creating another human rights mess and taxing the scarce resources of the Mexican government, which has not done anything to accommodate such guests in any decent way. Whatever Mr. Trump decides to do is accommodated by AMLO and his government. Obediently, they are the welcoming mat of Mr. Trump. And that's why Trump, in a recent speech, said that Mexico was indeed paying for the wall. That's exactly what's happening. Mexico itself has become Mr. Trump's wall. And Mexico is paying for the National Guard, and Mexico is paying for the refugees that come back while they wait for the asylum trials and so on and so forth. On top of which, Mr. AMLO decided to go ahead and insist in a much watered down free trade agreement with the US. Watered down, the new trade agreement is a disaster for Mexico because it's not free trade, it's managed trade of the worst kind. It taps the maximum salaries that workers, the minimum salaries that workers can be paid in certain industries to an absurd number that came out of the hat of someone of $16 per hour. Now, you cannot fix salaries by decree. Salaries are the result of productivity of the workers in an environment which helps them to be productive, which is not what happens in Mexico. The environment is totally against the productivity of workers, and that's a problem of bad policies of the government. Just to give you an example, A Mexican worker that crosses the border to the US is 6 times more productive than in Mexico. The same worker, despite the fact that he has a different language that he doesn't necessarily understand, different customs that he doesn't have the support of his family and friends. He is in an alien and not necessarily very welcoming atmosphere in the US. Why is he more productive? Because everything around him allows him to be more productive. He is able to get to his job by efficient transport in the morning, unlike Mexico. He doesn't face electricity interruptions several times a day, like in Mexico, and so on. You take the life of a worker in Mexico and the same worker in the US, and it's totally different. Therefore, given the circumstances and the environment that surrounds him, he's far more productive, 6 times more productive in the US. You don't increase wages in Mexico by decree, which is what the new US Mexico Canada trade agreement does. You increase them by working at improving the environment that surrounds the worker, and this is something that this government has not done. Public works are nowhere to be seen. They haven't done any useful public work, but they canceled the New Mexico City airport, which was going to be one of the best in the world, of the quality of the new airport in Istanbul or Beijing. They canceled that by the fact that it was 35% built and it was paid for by debt that had been already placed and long-term debt that was going to be serviced by the taxes of passengers that would flow into that airport. All of that they shattered by the puerile decision of AMLO, who disliked the project because he said that a poor country cannot have a good airport. It should have an appropriate airport for poor people, which I guess it's a poor airport. And now he's building one in 70 kilometers away from Mexico City in an Air Force base, which is a complete nonsense. And he wants to keep the Mexico City airport operating, despite the fact that the airspace of those two airports are conflicting. So, you cannot govern the country, the 14th largest economy in the world, by whatever occurs to you that morning or whatever prejudices you have been fostering for years, which is exactly what AMLO and his accomplices have been doing for the last 15 months. What's really surprising has been the resilience of the country and of the economy not to fall down faster. I confess that I predicted a much faster destruction of the country and much faster terrible results. But those have not happened yet, but will happen this year.
I've also had the feeling, as you, things getting worse, and I'm also kind of surprised that it hasn't gotten worse sooner. He's also tried raffling off or selling the presidential plane, which you wrote about, as well as he didn't show up to Davos. And some of these things I think are important. Some people might have disdain for groups such as Davos, but I think it's important from a diplomatic perspective to show up, that there's a value there. And I think it's important to have the diplomatic function of a presidential plane to get around and get things done. And in your article, you pointed out that Mexico doesn't even own the plane. So, I mean, is this true that Mexico can't sell the plane?
No, it's a lease. The plane was leased. The leasee was Banobras, the Mexican infrastructure bank in Mexico, and the lessor was Boeing. Or Boeing has a branch, an associate corporation that is in the business of leasing planes. So it was a lease, just like you lease a car. You have the use of the car, but you cannot sell the car. That's exactly the case. That's number one. Number two, I used the case of an airplane as a metaphor that they keep coming with these harebrained ideas that don't make any sense, and they put them as priorities instead of solving the real problems of the economy. Some people suggest that they are just sort of taking the attention away from the real problems, which are there and will not go anywhere and will come back to haunt them. So the whole absurd idea of the plane is ridiculous. Now, on the issue of AMLO not traveling abroad, I happen to agree completely with him. I mean, it would be shameful to see such an uncouth, ignorant man representing Mexico in international fora. It would be a shame. So I'm glad that he has decided to keep himself away from international travel, because he could be shaming the country and dragging it down to his level, which is very much the swamps of Tabasco. That's why his nickname is Peje Lagarto, which is sort of an amphibious reptile that lives in the swamps of Tabasco. You don't want that character being paraded around in international meetings and meeting statesmen and so on and so forth. It would be horrible. So in that sense, I agree with him.
Some of my Mexican friends who are supporters of AMLO are not going to enjoy this interview. So you mentioned NAFTA 2, or the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and in one of your articles you cited a fellow at Cato who called it the worst trade agreement ever made, I believe. But looking also at China, it seems we've got this new Cold War, this global rivalry between China and the U.S. and China's with its Belt and Road project. It's all over the place. Do you see China making any significant inroads into Mexico?
Well, I haven't seen any signs of that happening yet. The Chinese were very close to many Latin American countries in the last decade, basically to buy raw material. So they were in Venezuela for the oil and other mining products. They were in Argentina for the grains and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure they made a very good business, because they lent a lot of money to these countries, which are not going to be paying anytime soon. So Mexico was not in that league, because Mexico was not in the business of selling raw materials, but selling industrial products and competing with the Chinese in the US market. So we were competing economies rather than complementary economies. How do I see the prospects of China coming big time in Mexico? Not very strong, for the same reason that AMLO has decided to be the docile puppet of Mr. Trump. See the scandal that Trump has raised in relation to Huawei coming into the UK. He's outraged, and he told Boris Johnson terrible things. I mean, the Whitehall was appalled by the language. I don't see why anyone would be appalled by anything Mr. Trump does, but that's a different matter. The Chinese had proposed to the Mexican government in the previous administration to do 5G Wi-Fi in the whole country free, and the previous administration recanted because of pressures from the US. Now, this administration is far more obsequious to the Americans than the previous one. So I don't see the Chinese coming and doing anything in a large scale. It would be very welcome that they came to do some infrastructure works, which they have proven to be very competent at doing. And now that AMLO is doing, guess with whom? Not contractors from anywhere in the world, not competitive bidding. He's asking the army to build a new airport. He's asking the army to build a new railroad. And the army is doing all sorts of strange things that they never used to do. Let's see how this thing ends. But I don't think the Chinese are going to be very welcome, or that they will find any appetizing projects in AMLO's Mexico in the near future.
There are a few articles you've written at Cato that deal with the dangers of the national security state and censorship and the growth of autocracy. And I think if we look around the world, we can see these trends of growing censorship, surveillance, security, militarization state, including in the West. Do you feel there exists the real danger or potential for autocracy in either the U.S. or even Mexico?
Well, in Mexico, certainly. I mean, all of what the crux of the political project of AMLO is to centralize power in his hands, all of it. And that's why he's fighting all the autonomous entities that were created in order to take the decisions away from the central government and be a fair judge vis-a-vis the private sector and so on in issues like electricity and oil bidding and so on. So he's neutralizing or canceling all the autonomous entities that had been created by many previous administrations of all sorts. I mean, not only the PRI but the PAN. His next target is the National Electoral Institute, where he will have to the chance to renew 4 of, I believe, are 12 members of the council, and that could neutralize many of its decisions. So he wants to recentralize elections back as they were in the 1980s and early 90s to control them from the government. So, and he also has sent a law or a legislative project that would curtail freedom of speech and writing. Of course, he says the opposite in his daily, I hesitate to call them press conferences. They are more like homilies of a religious nature, but in his daily things every morning, he constantly lambasts the so-called adversaries that write critically of him. And this has been reflected by a new project, a legal project that would curtail freedoms of publishing and in the media, in the spoken and televised media as well. See, in authoritarian governments, they more or less tolerate the written word more than the TV and other visual and auditive media, for the simple reason that fewer people read. So the danger is less acute. So what has happened already, and look at the scenery of Mexico's broadcast, radio, and television newscasts, the most critical elements of those programs have been removed. You have Carlos Loret de Mola out of Televisa. He's no longer on the TV. You have Joaquin López Dóriga out of the TV, and a series of other well-known critical commentators with many years of experience have been removed. Sarmiento is out of his morning newscast, etc. So this is just by a gentle, quote, gentle pressure on the broadcasters, which, as you know, this is a concession from the government. Both television and radio are not property of anyone but a sovereign property of the nation, and the nation can allow private activity, but in the form of a concession, and the concession can be withdrawn at any time. Okay, that's the Damocles spade on top of every radio and television producer's head. If they are disliked by the government, they can cancel their concession and they are out of work. What they intend to do now is to codify that in a law that would be far more restrictive and that would allow people to be sued in the most without really any solid foundation. So let's see if that law eventually is adopted or not. But so far, the threat is there.
Coming down to one of my final questions was back to the economy. There's a sentiment that we're on the cusp of a catastrophic global financial collapse. Meanwhile, the economy keeps chugging along and stocks continue to hit highs. What's your general economic outlook, I guess, globally in North America, Europe for 2020 and beyond? Are we on the cusp of some, new global financial crisis, or are we going to be all right?
Look, economists are not qualified to predict the future. I think the only reason why there are meteorologists in the world is to help critics of economists because they are even worse than economists. Okay, econometrics is nothing more than a sophisticated way of predicting the future based on what happened in the past. Very few people, and you can count them with hands, with the fingers of one hand, perhaps in the case of the U.S., predicted the 2007 housing meltdown that led to the 2008 crisis. Everyone in the big institutions, the Federal Reserve System, the banks, analysts, everyone was cheering that the great moderation, as Alan Greenspan called the long period in which no major crisis had erupted, was here to stay. Well, it wasn't. In today's circumstances, you see some excesses. By the way, I was one of those that predicted the 2006 downward trend in housing when I moved to Washington in 2004, because I saw the prices of houses and I figured out this cannot go on. I rented a house that supposedly was worth $1 million. I mean, the market value of that house was $1 million, and the rule of thumb tells you that you should pay a monthly rent of roughly 1% of the value of the house. I was paying 0.3%, 1/3 of what the suggested price would be, which means that there was a huge misalignment between the prices of housing and the rental price. That was obvious then. I don't see any bubble of that size in the current U.S. market. Perhaps the most noticeable bubble is in the stock market. I mean, when you have the stocks of Tesla that yesterday were trading at 115 years value, that means that if you buy a share today, given the expected profits of the company, you would require 150 years of dividends to pay for that share. That's ridiculous. I mean, the normal number is about 12 times. This is 115 times. There's a bubble in the stock exchange. Now, how will it be dealt with? Well, that's very much uncertain. There are many elements to worry about. The piles of debt that have been accumulated by the public sector and the private sector worldwide, which, by the way, makes sense if you have virtually zero interest rates. So you can fund all your projects on zero interest rate debt and make 5, 10, 15%, and that's a killing. That means that everyone is riding on a wave of debt, and that will sooner or later will have to be dealt with, but it's not clear when. I don't see any element that will help burst bubble, if there is one, in a dramatic way in the near future. But no one can tell you that for certain. So the best bet is to be careful about your investments and certainly avoid the most speculative ones. And I would not jump into the U.S. stock exchange today under any circumstance, because the probability is that it goes down rather than up. But I don't think a precipice is in sight anytime immediately.
All right. I've run out of questions. Is there anything else that you feel important to mention regarding Mexico, the U.S., anything else, or any final thoughts to leave us with?
Well, I think that I would like to see political opposition rebirth in Mexico. The parties that used to exist have virtually disappeared from the map. There is no one to be consistently analyzing what the government is doing and criticizing it in a constructive way, proposing alternatives, although we know that this administration will not consider any alternatives to its way of doing things. But nevertheless, I'm very saddened that there's no strong political opposition. I would hope that there's a rebirth of political parties more combative and clear-headed and with an agenda. And I also hope that the press remains being critical and doing its job, because as the Washington Post has adopted as his banner, democracy dies in darkness. And this is exactly what the intentions of the AMLO administration are, as he continues his destruction of Mexican institutions and Mexico's democracy. I think that along with the economy, I think that that's the most worrisome part. He himself is very much aware that his changes and reforms can be undone, and he's trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. And he's doing that by doing exactly what he and his accomplices have done in Mexico City. Once you get to government, as they did in 1997, you don't leave it. You cling to it, which is exactly their plan for the federal government in the foreseeable future. And that would mean, tyranny and autocracy, with or without AMLO in charge, because they are trying to rig the system in order to remain in it for the foreseeable future. So I would hope that a strong reaction to that remains alive and well in terms of political parties and the media doing their job.
All right. I hope Mexico continues to hang in there. I know Mexicans are tough people, and so I hope we, now that I'm Mexican, I can say we, myself, continue to hang in there and fight against what's going on. Are there any books or websites that you'd like to recommend for us to visit?
A long list. I will send you a list via email, and perhaps you can include it in this podcast.
Yeah, I'll include it in the description, so I'll put that there. I know you write for the Cato Institute, Asia Times, and other places.
No, Excelsior in Mexico City. I write a weekly column in Excelsior every Friday.
Okay, we'll check that out, and I'll post the link there for the Spanish speaking folk. And all right, muchas gracias again, Dr. Manuel Suarez-Mier, for being with us on Geopolitics and Empire.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.